My own approach to development and evolution is based on this idea of a developmental system, which is simply a changing complex, very, very heterogeneous, elements both within and outside of the organism. So it includes the developmentally relevant aspects of the environment, including the abiotic environment. This is a very fluid, large, extended notion of system. And it's defined with reference to the organism. So these are those elements of the surroundings, of the environment. I would like always to have an S after that word, at various scales that play a part in this organism's world. The makeup, then, of such a developmental system varies over time, and it varies with the organism. I call such a complex a system simply because its constituents, what I sometimes call its interactants, are causally interdependent. They're interdefined. What counts as an interactant, how it works, as well as what kinds of effects it has, is contingent on the larger complex, as well as the point of view of the investigator. So depending on the research context, you're also going to have a different description. In a certain sense, although this is a maximal idea of system in a certain way, because it's so big and floppy, it's also a minimal notion of system in that it doesn't assume automatic self-regulation or very, very tight stability. Some regularity obviously is necessary for there to be an organism at all. But one of the reasons, in fact, that I've been engaged with the nature-nurture complex, I struggle with this phrase because in many languages there isn't a nice translation of it, but it encompasses things like genes versus environment, biology versus culture, the innate and the acquired, instinct and learning. One of the reasons that I have been so engaged with this problem for so long is that it has often been used to prejudge stability, which in fact explains why people are so ready to use it, and in fact also why it's often so dangerous to use it. Causal interdependence in this kind of developmental system certainly doesn't make it unanalyzable. This is one of the fears that people often have. An interactant's impact on an organism or its association with variation among organisms can all be evaluated. But no interactant is privileged a priori as a bearer of form or as the locus of causal control. That is, a plant or an animal isn't explained by encoded representations in its chromosomes, for example. Or the phenotype isn't merely an appearance, a manifestation of an underlying essence that generates it, but which it can misrepresent. I'm curious, actually, are biology students still taught that the genotype is the genetic makeup of the organism and the phenotype is its appearance? Yeah, okay. I think you have the essence and appearance encapsulated in those definitions, in fact. So what does this mean? It means that an organism's nature is just the organism itself, in whatever world it lives. That means then that it's never static. So instead of thinking of nature as something that stands outside and exists before the organism, just the organism. It emerges in time, it emerges in space, and if we take that, then nature has no existence prior to or separate from the concrete living organism in its concrete and often living surroundings. So there are no Platonic ideals here. There's no underlying reality that's more basic than the being itself. There are no little tiny instruction manuals inside the cell nucleus. No engineers in there either. Perhaps even by now it's clear why during a certain period Francisco and I tended to find ourselves on the same panel at conferences. But perhaps you can also see the way in which having begun my journey with the nature-nurture problem, I was led to make certain kinds of emphases and insist on certain things that were somewhat different from his. This was true at least during that period when I saw him most, at those conferences and also at meetings of the Lindisfarne Fellowship. Let's take a turn through time. When I've been faced with this polymorphous and often quite perverse opposition between nature and nurture, I've refused the usual reasonable compromises that are offered to us. Resolutions like it's both nature and nurture, or it's really a continuum between nature and nurture. I've done something rather more peculiar. Consider the Möbius strip. We all played with these as children, perhaps, a strip of paper. You turn one end halfway, and then you join the ends. And you then have a miraculous object. Yes, it has one side, it has one edge, it's a complete puzzle. I'm told that if you take a regular three-dimensional bottle and turn it through a fourth spatial dimension, you get a Klein bottle, which also has delicious properties. Among them, useful for my purposes, its insides are its outsides. Okay. Keep those in mind and imagine then the nature-nurture continuum that we are offered by enlightened common sense. What if we take the nature end of this so-called continuum and give it a turn through time? Now you no longer have two loci of causal control. You no longer have alternative explanations of developmental events. You don't have the dichotomy at all, even as a continuum. You no longer have a nature and a nurture that can be compared in the way they usually are. They're no longer of the same logical type. What I've offered as an alternative to this, then, is a nature that is the continuous product of nurture, that is, its own development. But of course, it's not only a product of that process, it actively participates in that process. So the organism is a moving product of a process in which it participates. This process, then, is development. And nurture becomes all the developmental interactions over the entire lifetime. Development here, then, is not just the period before adulthood. It is something that goes on throughout the entire life. In fact, it can be construed as continuous with life. So, no longer associated with the arbitrary or the learned, the acquired, or the malleable, nurture is nothing less than the ongoing processes of development. These developmental processes produce both the typical and the atypical, both the stable and the fluid, both the phylogenetically conserved and the variable.